So in this how-to video, we're going to go through all the ins and outs of what you're going to need to set up your machine for sewing leather. And we're going to show you in real detail loads of little tips and tricks that I've got to make it really easy for you to do. So there's quite a few essentials that you'll need to pop on your machine before you start sewing leather. The first one what we're going to talk about is the Teflon Foot. So in all of our kits, we do provide these universal Teflon feet. Now the great thing about Teflon feet is it means that it will glide over the surface of the leather and stop the stitches from skipping, hopefully. And it is really great because these ones are like a clip-on one, so you can basically clip them on and off really easily. But for example, if you were to have a Bernina machine, some people might find that these ones don't fit on a Bernina. So you'll actually have to source the foot that's attached to the arm as well, specifically for your machine. But in general terms, most of the time this universal one fits on absolutely perfectly. And then depending on how easy you found it to source the foot, now brilliant if you've sourced it from us, that's great. But if you're trying to source anything locally to you, what I could recommend is if you've got a walking foot, that could be really good. Or a little trick that I've found before is actually getting tissue paper. And if you lay the tissue paper on top of the leather and then start stitching, it should again glide over the surface, and then you just have to rip it away afterwards. It can get a little bit messy, to be fair, but it is a good alternative if you don't have the Teflon or the walking foot. The next thing that you're going to need is a leather point needle. Now they differ from normal sewing needles. Normal sewing needles have an actual point, but with the leather point needle, it's actually more like a knife blade. So every time it goes into the leather, it sort of slashes through, and again should really help the machine. And in my opinion, the Schmetz needles are the best brand. And if you can go as big as possible, again, it should really help you with sewing leather. So these ones are 120 and Schmetz is the brand. And just make sure that you're definitely looking out for that leather point. So if you have a look at sort of the actual tip of the point, you will notice it has just got more of that sort of cutted knife blade. And it really honestly is the best thing that you can get. The next thing that you're going to need is to pop your threads on. Now, depending on kind of what you're doing, I really recommend using the Gutermann thread, the polyesters. They're absolutely brilliant on the leather. In industrial sewing, I do use the nylon bonded thread, which is about the same thickness as this top stitching thread. But I have found it's more problematic on the domestics. So for the domestic machines, I really recommend the top stitching thread, which is a little bit thicker in the Gutermann, and then the also, which is basically their sort of normal thickness thread, but just to flag up to definitely go for the polyester, because you don't want it to perish, so you know it will last forever, the polyester. So I'm now just going to go through how to wind up the bobbin. So for this particular machine, to wind the bobbin, we've got the top loading bit here. So I'm going to pop the bobbin on there, that's the bobbin winder. And then you place your thread on this prong, and it's got a little stopper that you have to put on there. And then grab the thread. Now for the bobbins, when sewing leather, I really recommend that you have the thinner thread. So this is the also Gutermann on the bobbin. And then when you're sewing the top stitch thread, you do that on any of the visible bits when you're sewing the bag. So it doesn't need to be on all of the seams. The basic seams, you're just going to do the thin thread like this. So this just has a couple of different cogs that you have to go round. A tension plate here, you have to make sure the thread's right in. And then we're just going to loop it round. I tend to sort of wrap it under itself as well. Alternatively, you do have the little holes in these bobbins, so you could always pull the thread through that and hold that, but I quite like to just loop it round. And then we just push this to the side, which basically enables it to go up and down. And then you put your foot down on your pedal and off you go. And what we're looking for with bobbin winding is that it's evenly distributing from top to bottom. If for any reason you find that it's kind of gathering more on one side, just use your finger to kind of manually push it down. because the bobbin being wound evenly really helps the machine to have a lovely regular stitch. And this one goes until the point that it automatically will ping out when it's completely full. Right, and then that's it. All done, ready for loading. So we're now going to actually thread up the machine. So we pop it onto the spool holder there. Pop that on top. And then this machine is brilliant actually, it's got the numbers so you can follow that. So most machines are a very similar theory. There'll be a cog at the top that you'll come round. You'll then loop down and then come back up to the hook, and you have to make sure, so potentially if your hook is lower down, you can use this hand wheel to the right hand side, the hand crank, just to make sure it's up really nice and high. And then you make sure it's caught in the hook, and you come back down this bit, and then there's a tiny little hook right at the back that you need to thread it around, and then thread the needle front to back and pull through. So that's the top thread, the top stitching thread all done. And for this machine we've got actually a top loading bobbin, so I'll show you how we put this in. So you take the bobbin case or bobbin shield bit off here, so this just releases it with a little button, and then you pop it in, making sure that it's going round clockwise, and there's a very small little nick in the bobbin holder that you have to make sure that it definitely goes up into, because that's the essential for making sure the tension stays perfect. And then in order to get the thread from the bottom bobbin up through the hole here so that we can start stitching, you actually have to use the hand crank again, winding it towards you as though you're doing a stitch. And if you actually look at the thread here, you have to hold this, not do it too tight, and just thread one stitch worth up and down, and then you can pull on the thread, and that's actually the bobbin thread now coming through. And then the next thing to do is just pop the plate back on and clip it in place. Now if any of you have actually got a machine that's got the bobbin case separate, what you have to do is make sure with the bobbin case hole sort of front ways on, you place the bobbin in, and again it's the same theory that it always unravels going clockwise up into the hook. So it's a similar sort of tension where you have to make sure it fits right into the hook, but that's the difference between this top loading one and then having a separate bobbin case. So one of the really important things when sewing leather is to think about your stitch length. Most of the time I tend to say stitch length 4. Now this is actually in terms of the length, so it refers to it being a 4mm stitch. And the reason we do it quite big is because every time that needle goes in, it does leave a permanent hole in your leather. So if your stitches were at a stitch size 2, so 2mm away from each other, you're basically making a little perforated line of holes, which could potentially mean that the leather would rip. So I would say a 4 is a really safe bet for sewing your leather. So when sewing leather, you do sometimes find that the stitches might skip. So if your machine has this, the great thing to do is, this is a pressure foot presser gauge. So you can adjust it to increase the presser foot pressure on different materials that you're using. So for example, with leather, I actually really like to increase the pressure so that actually you're putting more pressure on it, so it should prevent it from skipping. Now in terms of your manual, what it will actually say is that's for the thinner materials, is to put more pressure on. But what I've kind of analysed over the years is actually the more pressure you put on it, the better it will be for your leather. So give it a go, and if you don't have this, it doesn't matter at all. It's just quite a nice convenient thing if you do. So when working on the domestic machines, you've got to be really careful about the thickness of the leather that you'll be sewing. I really highly recommend something that's about 1 millimetre thick, because you've got to think by the time you team a few layers together, that does really increase the depth. So this one is a chrome tanned leather, so really nice and supple and soft, and great because it does sew on the domestics absolutely brilliantly. You could alternatively use something called Veg Tan Leather, which is to do with it having a vegetable tannin dyeing process. So this is the chrome tanned, which is a certain type of dyeing, and then the vegetable tanned, it makes it kind of like slightly thicker, still can be quite supple, but I'd say if you're going to go for the veg tan, think about it again being about 1 millimetre thick. You wouldn't want to go for the veg tan that's the really thick stuff, because your machine's just going to really struggle with that. And then the other thing to consider with leather is it really does stretch, and different types of animals stretch more than others. So most of the time I use cow skins, and within reason they've got sort of little stretching. But if you use things like goat skins, they are so stretchy. So all the time anyway, in general with our bag making courses, we will always be using something called a stabilizer, which is like an iron-on interfacing. So the great thing about that, it really prevents and stops the leather from stretching, and it should make it actually really nice and easy for you to sew the leather as well, because it won't stretch as you're going, it just stays nice and stable. So to bond that on, you just use an iron, nice hot iron with no water in it, because you don't want any steam or anything. And you just place it on, rubbing all over, you know, really make sure that you generate the heat right out to all the edges. Don't be shy to kind of get the heat on the underneath of the suede of the leather. That's absolutely fine. And then I'm going to do some little demos on single layers of leather, double layers of leather, and then ones when you've actually got the fusing on the back as well. So I definitely recommend that when you're first starting out, just try out your stitching on a bit of scrap leather, because you wouldn't want to sort of go to like a final project and plough into doing the final thing straight away. It's good to build your confidence just with a little scrap. And what I recommend is using a tiny bit of this stuff called Silicone Spray, if you have it. It's basically a lubricant, so it's almost like an oil that sprays onto the surface of the leather and will really help it glide. So give it a nice little spray, pop the leather under, put your foot down. And what I find really good when sewing leather is to actually hold the back bit of the little tails of the threads to just get going. So off you go, you can get the needle put down, and then you want to go as slow as possible as well, because you know the essentials of leather is that you always get like that permanent hole in the leather. So the slower you go, the more likely it is that the stitch won't skip at all, and that you get that lovely even stitch all the way. So most of the time you're probably rarely going to do a single layer of the leather when you're sewing. So what I'm going to show you now is doing a double layer. So we're going to place the 2 layers together. And again, I've still got a bit of the silicone spray on, so we're all good to go straight away. Now what's quite important with a lot of our stitching is to do some back tacks right at the beginning. And in order to get your back tacks going, I think it's actually quite good to start about 1 centimetre in from the edge, do your reverse stitch right to the edge of the leather. It doesn't matter if you slightly go off. And then when you get going again, pull those little tails, and it should really help to get the machine going, because you do find with 2 layers of leather, you know, it's a little bit harder going through, and just go really nice and slow. Nice even speed. So that's your 2 layers there, and you can see it's such a dream going through the chrome tanned. And then the next thing I'm going to show you is the leather that's got the fusing on the back. So this is really nice and stable now. So if you pop it under, you'll notice it's so much more solid. I'll give it a little spray with the silicone. So in some ways this is a little bit more like sewing fabric when it's quite as solid as this. And really just take your time. The most important thing is to just do accuracy with leather. So once you start to actually construct your final bag, majority of the time you're going to be doing the construction technique of the right sides of the leather facing each other, and you're sewing because it's a turned bag, so all the seams will be on the inside. So what's important with this is to really make sure that you're always starting about 1 centimetre in. Never start right on the edge, because sometimes what happens if you start right on the edge is the nature of it being so slippy and slidey is it will always push that top layer and you'll end up with an uneven start. So by anchoring the needle down about 1 centimetre in and going in reverse first, it should really prevent that. So you go right to the edge, and then again you're going to tug on those little tails just to help it, because most of the time the leather thickness, the foot is slightly going up a hill, so it does struggle to get going, but once you're back up on the even surface it should be absolutely fine. And another thing to point out, if you've got like numerous layers, so perhaps you've kind of got a seam that has come up from the middle section here and then you're having to come across it afterwards, you end up that you've got 4 layers of leather all in one area. One tip that I'd say if your machine is struggling at all to get up and over it is just put your finger on the very front of the foot, and again that should basically provide the machine with a little bit more pressure to really stop the stitches from skipping. With most of our seam lines in bag making, we really want to make this nice and flat. Now, in regards to if you're sewing normal fabric, you would naturally just kind of press that seam open and it would sit nice and flat. But in leather work, you can't actually iron the surface of the leather. So what we do is a bit of hammering and a bit of gluing with the Copydex glue. So you'll have a nice rubber mallet and you're sort of opening up the seam and hammering it. So what that does is it relaxes the leather and sort of starts to allow it to know where it's supposed to be bending. And then with not too much Copydex glue, some people get very enthusiastic about the glue. It's almost like minimal glue is better. You're just going to put the glue on the seam allowance and a bit on the body of the leather or the bag, and apply the glue both sides. Don't be inclined to kind of put one side down first. Do put the glue both sides. And then again, you're just going to use your fingers this time to flatten it off. And it doesn't matter if any of this is a little bit messy, because you're going to be having a lined bag. So it means that all the lining will completely cover this up and none of this ever shows. So that's it nice and flat. Give it another hammer. And you can see you've created this lovely flat surface now. I really hope that you enjoyed that how-to video on how to set up your machine ready for sewing leather. If you want to pursue your handbag journey a little bit more, we've actually got loads of online courses, so head over to our website to find out more.